the company law together in one lecture. Therefore, right, as a lecture, okay, there is about 150 students in this lecture. However, of course, for your tutorials, okay, you will be separated into JD and LLB. And for the coming semester, I'll be your course leader. My name is John Ho, and myself and Dr. Lee Mushin will also be your tutor. I'll be taking one tutorial group, and remaining tutorial groups will be taken by Dr. Lee. Assessment, okay? Now, this course will be assessed by an exam and a written assignment. Now, unlike the year before, okay, there is no individual written assignment, okay? All you will have to do is you will have to do a group assignment. Now, what happened is, okay, the assignment question will be given out to you in about week 3 or week 4. Now, what you have to do is you have to form a group within your own tutorial group, say about 4 to 5 people. Okay, say about 4 to 5 people, and then you'll be asked to conduct a group presentation in week 11 or week 12 during your normal tutorial period. And at the end of your group presentation, so after you've conducted your group presentation, you then hand in your group assignment to your tutor. So in other words, the group assignment, okay, is basically the written form of your group presentation. So you'll do a 15 to 20 minutes group presentation, and then at the end of that presentation, you hand in a group assignment. Now that research assignment, that group research assignment, is worth 30%. The exam itself is worth 50%. And your presentation and class participation mark in tutor, okay, combined is worth 20%. Is that sense? And the exam, okay, 3-hour open book. Now, before the course starts, some students ask me about textbook. Now, personally, I don't have, or I don't use one particular textbook for this course. Now, if you really want to have a textbook, okay, now, for the one on, specifically on Hong Kong company law, okay, on Hong Kong company law, okay, I would recommend the one by Stefan Lowe and Charles Chu, Law of Companies in Hong Kong. Now that's very specific. That's specifically, okay, for Hong Kong company law. Now, but as we look at later on in this course, right, the majority of the cases that we study in this course are basically UK and some Australian based. And because Hong Kong company law, as you all know, okay, is based on English company. Now, if you want to have a good book on English company law, okay, the one I would recommend is the one by Sealy. L.S. Sealy, okay, L.S. Sealy, S-E-A-L-Y. And there's also a very good company law book by Brenda Hannigan. And there's also one called Gower's Principle of Company Law, G-O-W-E-R. Gower Principles on Company Law. Now again, okay, these are just some suggestions, okay? If you go to a bookshop, okay, a law bookshop, right, you will find numerous company laws. In fact, there's probably too many, okay? So these are some of the ones that I personally would recommend, okay? But you don't necessarily have to have them. Now, what's important about this course is, as you'll look at later, is you read the cases, okay? That's the most important thing, okay? Make sure you read the cases that myself or the tutor would from time to time assign you to do so. Now, for example, for this course, right, for the first reading, the first case I've asked you to read is the case Salomon versus Sachs. And from time to time, I would tell you in lecture, I'll send you an email, I'll tell you in tutor, the cases, the important cases that you should read for the course. Now, any other question about the course before we officially start? Now, for the purpose of this course, right, the main focus would be on company law and companies, which means for the law on partnership and sole trader, we'll just briefly touch upon in your tutor, in your first tutorial class. So for example, right, if you want to know more about the law on partnership, okay, what we'll do is in the first tutor, that's what we'll briefly go through. And if you want to know more about the law on partnership or sole trader, I would suggest you do more readings on your own. Right, the first question I'm going to ask is, why do you think company law is so important? Okay, apart from the fact that it is a required course on the PCL level, okay? Putting that aside, okay? Why do you think company law is so important on a practical basis? Or let me put it this way, what do you think is the significance of company law to a society?
Most people will form a company to conduct business, and usually my clients are all like company capacities.
Okay, so the straightforward answer is yes. Nowadays, right, in a modern society like Hong Kong, or in almost any modern society, right, when we set up a business, over 95% of individuals would choose what we call to use the corporate or company form. In other words, when we set up a business, let's say with our family, friends, or whatever, okay, we will set up a company, ABC company or XYZ company. Now, and also in reality, if you think about it, right, 9 times out of 10 on our daily lives, we are dealing with a company. For example, when you go and buy a mobile phone, okay, from Apple, for example. Apple is a company. So in other words, you are signing a contract, you're getting into a contractual arrangement with Apple to buy the mobile phone. Mobile service, okay? Regardless of which mobile service you use here in Hong Kong or any other part of the world, okay? That mobile service provider is itself a company. The bus company, okay, is a company. Our MTR, that is also a company, in fact, a publicly listed company, which we'll look at later on in the course. So in other words, on our daily lives, 9 times out of 10 on a daily basis, we are, as individuals, okay, we are dealing with a company or companies. Now, what we'll look at in this course later on is, well, what is the significance of that? Now, supposing I, as an individual, right, let's say I buy a mobile phone from Apple, okay? Now, that contract in law is between me, an individual, and the company, Apple. Now, what is the significance of that? What happens, okay, when a company or companies enter into an agreement with another individual or other companies? Well, what is the significance of that? Now, as we'll look at later, right, company itself, okay, is what we call an artificial entity. So if it's an artificial entity, so how can it enter into a contract like a natural person? What is the significance of that? That's something we'll look at later. Now, so by the end of this topic, what you should be able to understand is, right, number one, the steps that need to be taken to form a company. So, supposing you want to set up a business with your family and friends, and you decide to choose the corporate form. Well, how do you set up a company? Now, what is the effect of setting, from a legal perspective, what is the effect of setting up that company? So what happens, from a legal perspective, what happens after that company is set up, legally? Yes.
I think it's covered in the case of Solomon versus Solomon,
Yeah.
as well as Lee versus Air Farming.
Yeah.
It affords you certain safeguards in relation to the liability that you would otherwise sustain during the course of business.
Right, okay, so now, the legal jargon is that, right, once a company is set up, as your classmate said, right, it enjoys what we call limited liability. So that's why when you look at most company, right, it says, for example, ABC Company Ltd. Now, what that Ltd stands for, okay, is Company Limited, or Limited Company. Now, the reason why they put an Ltd or Limited at the end there is to show you that that company enjoys what we call limited liability. Now, as we'll look at later on in the course, right, what does that mean? What does it mean when a company enjoys limited liability? And also, as we'll look at later in the course, is, well, what if someone uses the company to abuse that limited liability? Is there anything that we can do about it? And also, of course, we'll look at later, what is the rationale behind separate legal personality and limited liability? Why is that so important? Okay, from a business perspective, okay, why is that so important? Limited liability and separate legal personality. And also we'll briefly touch upon the different types of companies that you can set up. Now, over 98% of companies that set up in Hong Kong or elsewhere, okay, they are what we call small private limited companies. Or sometimes, or in the newspaper, they call it the small and medium enterprise, okay? So companies that, for example, your parents or your friends set up, okay? 98% of those are what we call private limited companies. Now, in reality, only about 1 to 2% of companies in Hong Kong are what we call publicly listed companies. In other words, those companies that trade on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, okay? That only accounts for about 1 to 2% of all companies in Hong Kong. Now, in fact, that's the case everywhere in the world, okay? Regardless of the US or UK, publicly listed companies make up of about only 1 to 2% of a modern society. Majority of companies are what we call private limited companies. Okay, so we'll look at the birth of company, okay, the effect of incorporation, and most important of all, the classic principle of separate legal personality. Now, what it means is, right? Let's suppose you and your parents are your friends. Let's suppose you have a very great idea. And now you decide to set up a business. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 9 times out of 10, most individuals would use the corporate form to run their business. No, unless, for example, as you will look at later, right? If you go into private practice, for example, when you work in a law firm, okay, all law firms in Hong Kong operate on a partnership basis. Okay, law firm, accountancy firm, okay, those are usually on partnership basis. Yet the majority of businesses are in corporate form. Now, once that company is legally registered with the companies registered in Hong Kong, that company in law is regarded as a separate legal person. Now, let's say, for example, supposing I set up a company. Let's say it's called John Ho and Co. Limited. Now, even though, let's suppose I decide, let's say 95% of the shares is owned by me, 2% by my father, 2% by my wife, 1% by my mother, let's say. Now, even though I own 95% of that shares of the company, okay, that company, legally speaking, is a completely separate entity from me or from my other family members. Now, when we say the company is a separate legal personality, what it means is, from a legal perspective, okay, it means, number one, as a separate organization, separate legal person, it can form a contract with another individual or another entity on its own. Okay, so for example, ABC, John Ho and Company, signing a contract with, say, John Chang, for example. Okay, it can enter into separate legal agreement, and from a legal perspective, more importantly, it can sue someone in the name of the company, and it can also be sued by others should it commit a liability. Okay, can be sued, can sue, and can be sued. And also, right, once that company is set up, all shares within that company, okay, in Hong Kong in a free market is freely transferable. Now, although in reality, as we look at later, right, if it's a private limited company, okay, there are some restrictions on the share transfer. So, for example, if you decide to set up a company with your friend or your family, what you would usually do, as we look at later, right, in the Articles of Association, i.e. the rules that set up the company, you would impose a rule which says if the other shareholders want to transfer their shares, they would first have to transfer to the existing shareholders. And that's called the right of preemption, which we'll look at later on, okay? But generally speaking, shares in a company are freely transferable. Especially if it's the shares of a publicly listed company. Now, first question you might ask yourself is, why do we need separate legal personality? From a social and economic perspective, well, what is the purpose? Now,
to limit the liability of natural person.
okay, yes, right. First of all, is to limit the liability of natural person, right? People like, for example, when I set up my company, right? Supposing I own 95% of those, right? Is to limit the liability of me. So from an economic and social perspective, the reason why they decided to set up a company, right, is to encourage investment. Now, because from a legal history perspective, right, company only started to emerge in the mid-19th century, around the 1840s, 1850s period. Now, for those of you who have studied history, what happened in that period? Anybody? In England. Yeah? Right. The birth of the Industrial Revolution, okay, what happened was, it led to the growth of business organizations. Now, together with the expansion of the British Empire in the Far East, companies will become, the organization called companies, okay, they became more and more important. Does anybody know which one is probably the world's first multinational company? Yeah?
The British India Company.
Right, the British India Company. Now, what happened was, right, this was the mid-19th century, Britain, strictly speaking, did not rule India as a crown colony at the beginning. Strictly speaking, okay? All the activities, okay, were conducted by the British East India Company for the interest of the crown. Okay, it was only in the 1850s, okay, that India officially, okay, became a crown colony of Britain. So during that period, okay, for the first 100, 200 years, okay, India, okay, strictly speaking, large part of India was actually ruled by a company. So that's how company came about, okay? It was largely because of economic development, okay? Industrial Revolution coupled with the expansion of the British Empire. So, yes, the reason why we have separate legal personality and limited liability, okay, is to encourage investment. So, for example, if you set up a company, right, as we'll look at later, your liability is limited to the amount of issued capital that you agree to subscribe to. Okay? Your liability as a shareholder is limited to the amount of issued capital that you agree to subscribe to at the first place. That's what we mean by limited liability. Okay? Facilitate investment. To facilitate activities in the financial markets. Now, this diagram here, okay, in a very simple form, explain what we mean by limited liability on vis-a-vis a creditor. Now, usually what happens is, when, say, a company, okay, goes and borrows money from a bank. Now, because it is a separate legal personality, as I explained earlier, what it means is it can sign the loan agreement on its own as a company. Okay, it can sign a loan agreement on its own as a company. Now, what is the significance of that from a shareholder's and from a creditor's perspective? If, for some reason, okay, the company goes bust, let's say. The company goes into liquidation. Because the agreement was signed with the company and not the shareholder, okay, it means only the company is liable for that debt. Myself and my other family members, who are shareholders of that company, okay, are shielded from that liability. Now, of course, in reality, okay, it's not that simple. Okay, as we'll look at later, okay? In reality, it's not that simple. Now, usually what happens is, in reality, what happens is, right, supposing you are, let's say you're a private company, and let's say you want to borrow money from a bank. Yes, the bank will lend that money to the company, but guess what they would also require?
Guarantee.
Guarantee.
Right, personal guarantee from the shareholder. Yes, I will sign that loan agreement with you, the company. However, I want you, the majority shareholder, to act as guarantor for that debt. Now, when you study company law in Hong Kong, or in almost all common law jurisdictions, the first case, or one of the first case you would come across is the case called Salomon versus Salomon, which is a House of Lords case. Now, what happened in the case of Salomon? I'll just briefly explain, right? Now, Mr. Old Salomon was originally a bootmaker, a shoemaker. Now, in the 1890s, he decided to set up a company. Now, back in those days, in order to set up a company, you needed a total of 7 shareholders. So what he did was, he himself, his wife, and 5 of his children then set up this company called Salomon and Co. Okay? Himself, his wife, and 5 of his children. So total, 7 people. Now, what happened was, okay, the company was valued at about £20,000. Remember, this is the 1890s, okay? So £20,000 was a lot of money, okay? The company was valued at £20,000, so £20,000 worth of shares, and it had £10,000 worth of debenture and £9,000 of unsecured debts. Now, as we'll look at later, right? A debenture, okay, when someone issues a company a debenture, okay, that person becomes the creditor of the company. So, for example, right, sometimes in the finance section of the paper, you would read terms like bondholder, debenture holder. Now, what that means is, right, you are holding debt of a company. So, by holding that debt, you become a creditor of the company. Now, in reality, what happened was in this case, right? In reality, the company was well overvalued. Okay, there's no way back in the 1830s, okay, the company was worth $20,000. It was well overvalued. And in reality, okay, Mr. Salomon owned almost 98% of the company's shares. Now, what is even more interesting in this case was, he himself, Mr. Old Salomon, he himself lended money to the company. So as a shareholder, so at the same time, he was a majority shareholder of the company, holding over 95% of company shares. And yet at the same time, he was also one of the major creditors of the company. Okay, so his identity, okay, shareholder, a majority shareholder, and at the same time, creditor of the company. Now, what happened was, to cut a long story short, in the 1890s, there was a brief period of economic recession, and the company went bust. Now, when a company goes into liquidation, someone called the liquidator would be appointed. Now, in law, the role of the liquidator is mainly to represent the interest of the unsecured creditors. Okay? In law, as we'll look at later on, when we look at insolvency, right? The role of a liquidator is mainly to represent the interests of the unsecured creditors of the company. Now, Once the liquidator entered the picture, what they realized was, okay, the company owed a lot of debts. And in particular, what the liquidator realized was Mr. O'Sullivan became a secure creditor of the company. Now, because in law, as we'll look at later, when you issue a debenture or bond to a company, the bondholder or debenture holder becomes a secure creditor of the company. Now, the significance of that is that if you are a secure creditor, your interest here, right, is ranked ahead of the unsecured creditors. Now, in reality, what happens is, right, when a company goes bust, 9 times out of 10, there won't be enough assets to satisfy all the creditors. So creditors that are classified as secure creditors will get paid first before the unsecured creditors. So what that means is here, right, by issuing a loan or a bond to the company, Mr. O'Sullivan became a secure creditor, ranking in ahead of all the other unsecured creditors in the company. Make sense of that? Now, what the liquidator tried to argue here was, right? What the liquidator tried to argue here was, right? This was a sham, a fraud. Okay? What he tried to argue was, right? Mr. Salomon controlled the company as a majority shareholder, right? 97% of shares, and he himself, okay, issued a bond to the company. By doing that, the liquidator tried to argue, this was a fraud, a device. Now, the interesting thing about this case was, right, it went all the way up from the Court of First Instance, High Court, to the House of Lords. Now, at the Court of First Instance, at the High Court, okay, what the High Court said was the company has been set up. But this is what the law says, right? All it requires, right, was 7 shareholders altogether. And as the law said, right, Mr. Salomon, his wife, and 5 of his children. Does that satisfy the legal requirement? Yes. So is that a company? Yes. Does it make a difference that Mr. Salomon actually controls the company? No. Why? Because the company enjoys a separate legal personality. Remember, right? Once the company is set up, it becomes a separate legal person. Even though in reality, everything remains the same as before. It doesn't matter whether Mr. Salomon controls the company, controls the board, or controls the general meeting. The question that you need to ask yourself is, has the company been duly registered? At law, do you think the company has been duly registered? If the answer to that question is yes, then it is a company for some. Now, of course, the case was up to appeal, and it went to the Court of Appeal. Now, what the Court of Appeal did in this case was interesting, okay? They adopted a purposive approach to interpret the company law statutes. Now, what the Court of Appeal said was, right, yes, the legal requirements were satisfied. Mr. O'Sullivan, his wife, and 5 of his children, yes, 7 shareholders. However, okay, what the Court of Appeal said was, the company law statute was not designed to be used as a fraud or a sham. The company law statute, as the Court of Appeal said, right, was not designed for Mr. O'Sullivan to use 6 other dummies to defraud creditors and the market. So what they did in that case, the Court of Appeal did was, they adopted in common law a purposive approach to interpret the statute. Now, when it reached the House of Lords of Appeal, it then reached the House of Lords. And interestingly, the House of Lords unanimously decided that this was a company, full stop. This is a company. Now, what the House of Lords says, as opposed to the Court of Appeal, was the House of Lords adopted a literal approach in interpreting the company law statute. Right? In the Court of Appeal, they adopted a purposive approach, and when it reached the House of Lords, they adopted a literal approach in interpreting the statute. So, in other words, it affirmed the decision of the Court of First Instance, the High Court. So the question, according to the House of Lords, right, the question you ask yourself is, has this company been duly registered under law? If the answer to that question is yes, then it is nothing else but a company. Okay? If the answer to that question is yes, it is nothing else but a company. Does it matter that Mr. Salomon de facto controlled the business? No. Does it matter that he was also the secure creditor of the business? No. Because the question is, so the question before the House of Lords was, right, if you say that Mr. Old Salomon can be both the majority shareholder and the creditor of the company, the next question is, right, then who issued Mr. Salomon the debt? Answer? Who? The company, okay? Full stop. It is the company that issued Mr. Old Salomon the debt. Not Mr. Salomon himself, or not the other shareholders in the company. It was the company, on its own behalf, because remember it was a separate legal matter, it was the company who signed that loan agreement with Mr. Salomon, allowing Mr. Old Salomon to become the bondholder of that company. Now, what's interesting about this case is, right, if you study English legal system or Hong Kong legal system, right, this case is often used as a case, as a test case, to study statutory interpretation. Because, right, the Court of Appeal adopted a purposive approach, remember, whereas both the Court of First Instance and the House of Lords adopted a literal approach to the statute. In fact, if you go back to the archives, when this case was first decided in 1897, okay, a lot of newspaper and media actually criticized this case and argued that this case would enable individuals to use company as a fraud or as a sham. But remember, right, this was the 1890s we're talking about, right? Nowadays, right, I guess nobody would question that. So despite the fact that this is more than 100 years old case, right? Today, okay, separate legal personality, and as we'll look at later, limited liability, okay, is the core of company law. And that's also the reason why when you study company law anywhere, this is probably the first case that we study. Now this was then affirmed later on in the 1961 case. Okay, this was actually a Judicial Committee Privy Council case from New Zealand called Lee versus Lee Air Farm. Now what happened in this case was, just briefly, right, Mr. Lee decided to set up an air farming company, okay, where he would spray chemicals onto crops and then he decided to set up a company, okay, air farming company. Now, in reality, he was the only director of the company. He owned 99% shares of the company, with the remaining 1% held by his wife. And he was also the only employee of the company. shareholder, majority shareholder, director, employee. So in other words, in reality, Mr. Lee was actually wearing what we call 3 hats. Shareholders, directors, employees. Now the current long story short, what happened here was, right, he died in an air accident. Now, and according to the law of New Zealand back then, right, a widow of a deceased employee can enjoy social benefits. Now, what they tried to argue here was, right, Mr. Lee was not, quote, an employee. Okay? Mr. Lee could not be an employee because he was, at the same time, the shareholder, the majority shareholder, and the director. So the question was, right, well, how can he be an employee? Now, when it reached the Privy Council, what they said was, yes, of course he was an employee. Who employed him? The company. Okay? He was an employee, not of himself, he was actually an employee of the company. So if he was the employee, which meant his wife was, by law, was a widow of a deceased employee died in an occupational accident. So that allowed his wife, his widow, to enjoy social benefits. Any questions so far? Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, Salomon versus Salomon, okay, is probably the most important case in company law. And even over 100 years today, right, in all common law jurisdictions, okay, that spirit, okay, or we call it the spirit of Salomon, is still very much maintained. And this was also illustrated in the Hong Kong case, right? Good Profit Development Limited versus Lone Point. Now, what this case was about, to cover long story short, okay? This was about the contract for the sale of shares between parties. And the current long story short, what the court said was, right, this agreement to sell shares, okay, was between the company and the other parties, okay? In other words, it had nothing, okay, to do with the existing shareholders of the company. If you choose to sign the contract or the agreement with the company, okay, if you want to sue, you sue the company. Remember, right, what I said was, as a separate legal person, a company can sue, and it can be sued. So if you choose to set up or sign a contract with a company, if there's a legal action, you go against the company, not the individual shareholders. So this goes back to the first question that I asked you, right? What is the legal significance of a company entering into an agreement with someone? Now the legal significance of that is that if there is a legal action, it is between the company and the other party, not the individual shareholders of the company and the other party. So that's the reason why, right, when the bank lends money to the company, it often asks the majority shareholder to be the guarantor. Now, because 9 times out of 10 they would know that, right? The company itself, okay, has no assets. And if the company goes bust, okay, then the likelihood is the bank will not be able to get the money back. So what they would do is they would ask the majority shareholder to act as guarantor for that guarantee. Now, so what are the types of companies in Hong Kong? Now, if you want to set up a private company, now when we say private company, okay, we mean private companies that, like your family set up or your friend set up, okay? Private limited companies, okay? A company can either be limited by shares, that makes up about 97 or 98% of companies in Hong Kong, or you could have unlimited company with a share capital, but again, that only makes up about 0.1%. Or, if your company expands and grows, you may decide to list your company on the stock exchange. That's when they become a publicly listed company. Again, the publicly listed company will be limited by shares. Now, from time to time, okay, you would hear some business organization calls companies limited by guarantee. Now, these are mostly, for example, charitable organizations. Now, as far as this course is concerned, okay, when we say company, okay, what we are referring to is mostly private companies limited by shares and public companies limited by shares, okay? These two are the companies form that we'll be focusing on for this course. Okay, we'll do a short break and come back in 2 minutes, okay?